Chomsky was born on December 7, 1928 in Philadelphia. His undergraduate and graduate years were spent at the University of Pennsylvania, where he received his PhD in linguistics in 1955. During the years 1951 to 55, Chomsky was a junior fellow of the Harvard University Society of Fellows. While a junior fellow, he completed his doctoral dissertation entitled Transformation Analysis. The major theoretical viewpoints of the dissertation appeared in the monograph Syntactic Structure, which was published in 1957. This formed part of a more extensive work, The Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory, circulated in Mimeograph in 1955 and published in 1975. Chomsky joined the staff of MIT, or Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in 1955. In 1961 was appointed full professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics, now the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy. From 1966 to 1967, he held the Ferrari Award Professorship of Modern Languages and Linguistics. In 1976, he was appointed Institute Professor. During the years of 1958 to 59, Chomsky was in residence at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, New Jersey. In the spring of '69, he delivered the John Locke Lectures at Oxford. In 1970, he delivered the Bertrand Russell Memorial Lecture at Cambridge University, and in 1972, the Nehru Memorial Lecture in New Delhi, among many others. Professor Chomsky has received honorary degrees from several universities, including Cambridge University, McGill University, Columbia University, and Harvard University. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Science. In addition, he is a member of other professional and learned societies in the United States and abroad, and is a recipient of the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award of the American Psychological Association, the Kyoto Prize in Basic Sciences, the Helmholtz Medal, the Dorothy Eldridge Peacemaker Award, the Benjamin Franklin Medal in Computer and Cognitive Sciences, among others. Chomsky has written and lectured widely on linguistics, philosophy, intellectual history, contemporary issues, international affairs, and U.S. foreign policy. His works include Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, Language and Mind, Peace in the Middle East, The Political Economy of Human Rights, Volumes 1 and 2, with E.S. Herman, Fateful Triangle, The Culture of Terrorism, Manufacturing Consent, also with E.S. Herman, Necessary Illusions, Deterring Democracy, Year 501, Rethinking Camelot, JFK, the Vietnam War and U.S. Political Culture, The Common Good, Profit Over People, The New Military Humanism, New Horizons in the Study of Language and Mind, Rogue States, and most recently, 9/11 and Understanding Power. Dr. Chomsky has been called the most important intellectual in America today by the New York Times. But as Noam Chomsky likes to point out, that line would never have entered the pages of the New York Times if it had not been accompanied by its caveat in the same article stating, then why does he get U.S. foreign policy so wrong? So hopefully this afternoon you can decide for yourself if Noam Chomsky has U.S. foreign policy wrong. Without further ado, Noam Chomsky.
I heard a lot of rumors in the last few days that I'll be speaking about Israel and Palestine. So just to disabuse you of that misconception, I'm not. But if you'd like to bring that up or other things up in the discussion later, please feel free to do so. So I'll talk about some other things, but don't feel constrained later on. Obviously, there are many crucial contemporary topics I won't even mention. What I'd like to consider, keeping to the announced title, is the U.S. role in the world, what it is today, what it's likely to be tomorrow. The reasons for concentrating on the U.S. role should be too obvious to mention, but I'll barely mention them. The most obvious reason is that naturally the United States is the most important power in the world. It has overwhelming military force and other power, and it has a determinative impact on anything that happens in contemporary world history. The second reason is, of course, that we're here. So we have we happen to have an unusual degree of freedom, and for most of us, privilege that confers a enormous responsibility for our own actions, for our influence on policy, and even if it were not the case that this was by far the most powerful country in the world, that would or should be the primary thing that would concern us. I apologize for even mentioning this. It's such an obvious truism that shouldn't be mentioned, and I do so only because when anyone tries to pursue this transparently obvious course following the most elementary political and moral truisms, it elicits most intriguing reactions. I won't talk about that, but they're worth thinking about. Well, one measure of U.S. One way to measure the U.S. role in the world, there are many, but one way to measure it is by looking at U.S. aid, in particular military aid. It's not a very attractive topic for one reason, because, as is well known, U.S. aid, foreign aid, is the most miserly by far of any of the industrial countries. And if we take away the component that goes to one rich country and another middle-range country because of its association with the rich country, namely Israel and Egypt, there's almost nothing left. However, even if we count everything, it's still grotesquely marginal, becoming worse. But there is nevertheless some aid, and a lot of military aid, quite a lot, in fact, and that's worth looking at. That gives some kind of an indication of what the U.S. is doing in the world. Not the only one, but a good one. The connection between U.S. aid and foreign policy has indeed been studied. There's some academic work on it. Part of it is one study, a well-known study, was done on Latin America, U.S. aid in Latin America, by the leading academic specialist on human rights in Latin America, is Lars Schultz, University of North Carolina. He wrote an article about 20 years ago in which he pointed out that there is a very close correlation between U.S. aid and human rights abuses in Latin America. So to quote him, U.S. aid flows disproportionately to Latin American governments that torture their citizens, to the hemisphere's relatively egregious violators of fundamental human rights. That was 20 years ago. About the same time, Edward Herman, who was just mentioned, a co-author of mine occasionally, an economist at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, did a worldwide study looking at the same question, looking specifically at the relation between U.S. aid and torture, and it turned out there was a surprisingly unpleasantly high correlation between U.S. foreign aid and torture. Take a look at the Amnesty International records on torture and U.S. foreign aid, and the connection is very close. Well, statistical correlations obviously don't tell you about causal relations, and it's unlikely that the U.S. government has any specific interest in torture. So therefore he did another study, a much more important one. He studied the correlations between U.S. aid and other factors, and it turned out the best correlation, or one of the best, was between U.S. aid and improvement in the investment climate. So as a country improves opportunities for investors to extract resources and so on and so forth, foreign aid goes up. Well, that's a very natural correlation. That makes perfect sense. That's what you'd expect U.S. policy to be directed towards, and it is. And the fact that aid is correlated with improvement in the investment climate is not surprising. Well, how do you improve the investment climate in a third world country? One of the best ways is to murder union organizers and peasant leaders, to torture priests, to massacre peasants, to undermine social programs, and so on and so forth. That does have a way of improving the investment climate, and that yields a secondary correlation, the kind that Lars Schultz and he discovered, namely between U.S. foreign aid and egregious human rights violations. So it's not that the U.S., and that's probably the explanation, it's not that the U.S. has any particular interest in egregious human rights violations, it's just that it's a natural corollary to what it is interested in if you ask about how you achieve goals like that. Well, that was 20 years ago. About the time that these studies came out, the Reagan administration came into office, as you'll recall, I hope. The Reagan administration came into office announcing very loud and clear that the focus of U.S. foreign policy would be a war on terror. And they focused particularly on what they called state-sponsored international terrorism, the worst plague of the modern age, a crime carried out by depraved opponents of civilization itself in a return to barbarism in our time. And it had to be dealt with, as the administration moderate George Shultz put it, with force and violence, not by utopian legalistic means like mediation and negotiations and so on, which were just a sign of weakness. There were two areas where they were going to focus, where this crime was most severe, namely Central America and the Middle East. So now let's turn to the outcomes, what happened in Central America and the Middle East, and keeping in mind that we're still asking about correlation between U.S. aid and other aspects of policy. And certainly I should mention that Schultz's study pointed out that the correlation between egregious human rights violations and aid held specifically for military aid. The aid was independent of need, he checked on that, and it ran right through the Carter period. It was unaffected by the human rights rhetoric. Went up to 1980 when he wrote. So what happened in Central America and the Middle East in the 1980s? Well, in fighting the war against terror. In Central America turned into a graveyard. Hundreds of thousands of people were massacred, 200,000 approximately, over 1 million refugees, orphans, great masses of torture, every conceivable form of barbarism that you can think of. In one country, Nicaragua, the U.S. had to invade, basically attack it, because it didn't have an army to carry out the terror as it did in the other countries. The U.S. attack against Nicaragua was quite serious. It led to tens of thousands of people killed, the country virtually destroyed. It's now the second poorest in the hemisphere, may never recover. The U.S. was in fact brought to since in this case the U.S. was attacking a country, not just the people of the country, as in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras, the country was able to follow means available to states. So it responded in the way that a law-abiding state is supposed to respond to massive international terrorism. It went to the international institutions, first the World Court, which condemned the United States for international terrorism, for unlawful use of force and violation of treaties, as it put it, ordered the U.S. to terminate the crimes and to pay massive reparations. The U.S. responded by instantly escalating the war, bipartisan incidentally, and for the first time giving official orders to attack what are called soft targets, health clinics, agricultural cooperatives, and so on. And it led to this went on until finally the population voted for the U.S. candidate and the terror stopped in 1990. Nicaragua also went to the Security Council, and the U.S. rejected the World Court judgment, and the U.S. would have been condemned by the Security Council, but it, of course, vetoed the resolution calling on all states to observe international law. So the current leader of the war on terror happens to be the only state in the world that's been condemned by the World Court for international terrorism, and that has vetoed a resolution calling on all states to observe international law, a fact that perhaps is relevant to the current situation, and you'll search very hard to find any mention of anything I'm talking about, which has to do with the first phase of the war on terror, obviously not irrelevant. What about the other countries of Central America? Well, they fared far worse than Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, the people had an army to defend them. In the other countries, the terrorist force attacking the population was the army. And El Salvador and Guatemala was even worse than Nicaragua in this period. The war was actually El Salvador became the leading recipient of U.S. military aid during this period, and was carrying out some of the worst atrocities. And the war was a success. Terrorist war was a success. You want to find out what a success it was, just take a look at the documents produced by the notorious School of the Americas. One of their slogans now, their talking points as they put it, is, I'm quoting, that the U.S. Army defeated liberation theology. And that's pretty accurate. One of the main targets of the U.S. war on terror was the Catholic Church, which had made the grave error of turning toward what they called the preferential option for the poor, had to be punished for that. El Salvador is a dramatic example. The decade opened with the murder of an archbishop. It ended with the murder of 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals, and the U.S. Army defeated liberation theology. An interesting fact about our intellectual culture is that nobody knows anything about this. If 6 leading Czech intellectuals and an archbishop had been murdered by Russian-backed, Russian-armed and trained forces, we'd know about it, and we'd know their names, and we'd have read their books and so on. But you might do a little experiment and find out how many people you know, educated people, can even tell you the names of the Jesuit intellectuals, the leading Latin American intellectuals who were murdered by the forces, the elite forces that we armed and trained, or the archbishop, or 70,000 others, mostly poor peasants as usual. You'll find the answer. You know the answers without checking, and they tell us something about ourselves, something interesting about ourselves, worth knowing. Well, that's the success of the war against terror in Central America, the first focus. What about the Middle East, the second focus of the war on terror? Well, the worst, it's true there were plenty of terrorist atrocities in the Middle East at that time, state-sponsored. The worst of them, by a huge margin, was the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, ended up killing about 20,000 people. This was international terrorism. It was able to proceed because the U.S. gave the green light, provided the arms, provided diplomatic support, vetoing several UN Security Council resolutions that tried to get the fighting to stop and the forces to retreat. And it was a grand success as well. The Chief of Staff of the Israeli Army, Raful Eitan, pointed out right away that the operation had been a success. It removed the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, as a factor in negotiations for the occupied territories. And indeed, that was the goal of the war. It had nothing to do with Lebanon. It had to do with, it was in fact called openly in Israel, a war for the occupied territories. The PLO was getting extremely annoying with its insistence on negotiated settlement of the conflict. Israel didn't want that, and they succeeded in destroying it, driving it out of the region, which was a grand success. That's a textbook illustration of international terrorism, notice. Take the official U.S. government definition of terrorism, the threat or use of violence to achieve political, religious, or other ends through intimidation, imposing fear, inducing fear, and so on, directed against civilian populations. Here's a textbook example. Couldn't have a clearer example. International terrorism because of the decisive U.S. role. Notice, incidentally, that I'm giving the United States the benefit of the doubt. You might argue that this is much worse than international terrorism, that it's outright aggression. In fact, that's what you should call it. If it's outright aggression, then it calls for Nuremberg trials for the U.S. leadership and the Israeli leadership. But giving them the benefit of the doubt, we'll call it only international terrorism, and it's a clear case, and by far the worst case of that decade. Incidentally, the facts about, there's been 20 years of lying in the United States about the reasons for the war, but you have to give credit where credit is due. The New York Times finally came clean. On January 24th, if you read it carefully, there's a sentence buried in a report on another topic by James Bennett, which tells the truth. He, for the first time I've ever seen it in the United States, describes what was well known in Israel 20 years ago and what you could have read in the dissident literature for the last 20 years based on Israeli sources, that the war was fought for political reasons only. It was a war for the West Bank. The idea was to eliminate the threat of negotiations that was coming from the Palestinians. That's true. It's been well known for 20 years to everybody except the American population. And now there's a sentence that tells the truth, so you can now quote the New York Times on this. Makes it official. The documentation on this is just overwhelming from the first days of the invasion. So that's an improvement. You wait long enough, good things happen. Well, that's the worst act of terror in the Middle East. There were others. The peak year for Middle East terrorism was 1985. It was in 1985 that the annual poll of editors by the Associated Press picked terrorism in the Middle East as the top story of the year. And in scholarship on terrorism as well, it's picked as the top year and so on, and that makes sense. There was plenty of terrorism in 1985, not as bad as 1982, but bad enough. What were the worst terrorist acts in the Middle East in the peak year, 1985? Well, there are three candidates for first prize. Nothing else even comes close. One candidate is a car bomb in Beirut, placed outside a mosque, timed to go off when people were leaving the mosque so as to kill the maximum number of people. It did. It killed 80 people, wounded 250 others. A powerful bomb was killing babies in their beds down the street and that sort of thing. Most of those killed were women and girls leaving the mosque. The bomb was aimed at a Muslim sheikh who escaped. It was traced back to the CIA and British intelligence, and that's not particularly contested. And that's one candidate for the prize of worst terrorist act in the Middle East in the peak year of 1985. Second candidate would be the Israeli bombing of Tunis shortly, a couple months later. Tunis was bombed, killed about 75 people, Tunisians and Palestinians, attacked with smart bombs, torn to pieces and so on, civilians. It was pretty graphically described by a top Israeli reporter in the Hebrew press in Israel. Not too much talk here. This was again international terrorism. The U.S. was deeply involved. For one thing, the Sixth Fleet, which is in the area, did not inform the Tunisians, that Tunis is an ally, that the bombers were on their way, although of course they knew it. Secretary of State George Shultz responded to the bombing by immediately calling the Israeli foreign minister and congratulating them and expressing U.S. sympathy for the terrorist assault. Actually, Shultz drew back from this open praise for the massacre when the Security Council, the UN Security Council, passed a resolution unanimously condemning Israel for an act of armed aggression. U.S. abstained on that case and kind of backed off. But again, giving the benefit of the doubt to the United States and Israel, let's just call this international terrorism instead of, like the rest of the world, an act of armed aggression. Well, that's a second candidate. This was not there was no pretext that this was in defense, just like there wasn't any in the Lebanon War. The third, only other candidate I can think of is Shimon Peres's Iron Fist operations in March 1985 in southern Lebanon. The Israeli army was attacking what the high command called terrorist villagers, and there were big massacres and atrocities, lots of people killed by the Israeli army or by its mercenary forces in the south. A lot of them kidnapped, taken to Israel for interrogation, which means torture and imprisonment. And nobody knows the scale, because there's a kind of a principle of journalism and scholarship that you don't investigate your own atrocities. So we know down to the last person how many people were killed in some atrocity that you can attribute to someone else. But when we look at our own atrocities, we haven't even a clue. So, for example, if you take the U.S. wars in Indochina, say in Vietnam, the numbers, I mean, it was obviously millions of people killed, but the numbers aren't known within millions. Who would care to count, you know, or who would care to count how many hundreds of thousands of people have died from the effects of U.S. chemical warfare in South Vietnam? I mean, there have been some attempts to estimate outside the United States, but here it's just not an issue. We don't care about things like that. And so it goes. So we don't really know how many people were killed by U.S.-Israeli international terrorism in southern Lebanon and the Iron Fist operations, which, notice, were carried out by the left wing, what's called the left-wing Peace Party, which was in office at the time. Those are the only three examples that I know that are, and they're probably about in the same range. There is no other active international terrorism in the region that even comes close. So that's a good sample of the way the war on terror was fought in the second major area, the Middle East. Of course, it was fought elsewhere as well. So, for example, in Southern Africa, where the estimates are that about 1.5 million people were killed by South African depredations in the country surrounding South Africa. Forget what's happening inside South Africa. So in the Mozambique and Angola, about 1.5 million people were killed and over $60 billion of damage were caused just in the Reagan years alone, 1980 to 1988. Those were the years of what was called constructive engagement, at a time when South Africa was a valued ally, and Nelson Mandela's African National Congress was identified as, quoting, one of the more notorious terrorist organizations in the world. That's 1988, at the end of this period, while South Africa was still, of course, a valued ally after its actions in the preceding 8 years. Again, I'm putting aside what happened inside South Africa. And we can continue around the world. Well, without proceeding, there are a number of conclusions that follow. One is that the correlation between U.S. aid and extraordinary human rights abuses becomes so close that it isn't even worth studying. I mean, in the 70s and the 60s, you can sort of study it, but in the 80s, it's kind of identity. So there's a huge correlation between U.S. aid and massive human rights violations under the rubric of the war on terror. Second comment that, I mean, I'm not even talking about social health because it's redundant. And when you do this to people, you don't have to talk about the health consequences. A second consequence is, important consequence has to do with continuity. Not only is this continuous with what happened before, but the current war on terror, if you take a look at the people who are leading the current war on terror, what were they doing then? Well, the military component of the current war on terror is led by Donald Rumsfeld, who at that time was Reagan's special envoy to the Middle East, responsible for the war on terror that I've been describing there. The diplomatic side of the current war on terror is led by John Negroponte, appointed to the UN as ambassador to lead the war on terror. In those years, he was U.S. ambassador to Honduras, which was the base for U.S. terrorist operations in the region, specifically for preparing and supervising the war against Nicaragua, for which the U.S. was condemned by the World Court. So those are the two leading figures in the current war on terror, and they played a very significant role in the first war on terror, nor are they the only ones, which suggests something. Same people, same institutions, same policies. You kind of expect the same outcomes if you want to think about what the second phase of the war on terror will be like. Well, this is discussed in scholarship. So if you take a look at, well, to take one specific example, take a look at the December issue of Current History, serious scholarly journal, which is devoted to terror. on the problems of terror. And the authors, noted scholars and analysts, do identify the 1980s as the decade of state terror, which is correct. It was the decade of state terror. And they describe the United States as having effectively combated state terror in that period by taking what are called proactive measures. So the ones that I just described are proactive measures in defense against terror. They also suggest that the war against Nicaragua, for which the U.S. was condemned at the World Court, is a good model for further acts against terror. And specifically, two authors point out that it's a good model for the U.S. support for the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, the Contra war against Nicaragua. It actually 1985 in the Middle East is also mentioned. That's identified as the peak period of terror. And a couple of examples are given, not the ones I mentioned, of course, they can't be mentioned. The examples that are mentioned as illustrating why 1985 was the peak period of terror are two incidents, in each of which one person was killed, an American. One is a hijacking in which one American military officer was killed. Another is the Achille Lauro, the most famous incident, in which one person, an American, Leon Klinghoffer, a crippled American, was murdered. And these are indeed acts of terror. One person was killed in each case. Nothing like the acts that I described, of course, but they are acts of terror. The killing of Leon Klinghoffer, which is very famous, is comparable, for example, to an incident that just took place in Jenin a couple of weeks ago when a man in a wheelchair was trying to get out of the way of an Israeli tank and was crushed by the tank and his body torn to shreds. Or one that took place 2 days ago when a young woman who was trying to get to a hospital for dialysis treatment was blocked, prevented from getting there. She was also in a wheelchair and she died. And there are other incidents that are comparable to this, but it's easy to go on just to show continuities. But of course, none of this counts as terror. The Achille Lauro incident surely was terror. And it cannot be justified by the fact that it was undertaken in retaliation against the far worse terror of the Tunis attack a week earlier. Can't justify terror in retaliation, but of course that observation generalizes it. I'll leave it to you to draw the conclusions. That's assuming that we accept elementary moral principles, of course. That is assuming that we separate ourselves from 100% of the discussion of this topic. Okay, then the consequences follow. That's not the end of the interpretation. If you read the same issue, you find that the leading academic specialist on terror, professor at UCLA, he traces the roots of Osama bin Laden much deeper, and not just to Islam. He traces it back to the Vietnam War. He says that Viet Cong terror against the United States in South Vietnam kindled the idea that that the American heartland was now vulnerable. So the American heartland was vulnerable in South Vietnam when South Vietnamese were carrying out terror there against us. Another exercise for the reader would be to explore, for example, the Nazi archives and to see if you can find an analog to this analysis. You might try. It elicits no comment here. Another interesting commentary on the nature of the moral and intellectual culture in which we live, something we ought to be concerned about, I think. Well, let's go on. The acts of terror that I actually described in Central America, Middle East, South Africa, and so forth, they don't count as terror. They do not enter into terror, into the analysis, into the annals of terror as you in the scholarly literature on terror. They do enter, but not as terror. They enter as counterterror or as just war. And there's a principle. The principle is that if somebody carries out terror against us or against our allies, it's terror. if we carry out terror, maybe much worse terror, against someone else, or our allies do, it's not terror, it's counter-terror, or it's a just war. Now that principle is, as far as I know, close to universal. I mean, you might explore the massive literature on the topic and see if you can find an exception to it. And it's not just the United States. As far as I know, it's universal. Any place I've looked in a lot of different countries, that's exactly what you find. So the whole of European imperialism, this is the standard line. We do it to them, it's counter-terror or just war or bringing civilization to the barbarians or something like that. If they do it to us in their own countries, because remember, until September 11th, the West was immune. If we do it to them in their own countries at a vastly worse level, that's not terror. It's a civilizing mission or something like that. It was true with even the worst killers in history used the same techniques. So take, say, the Nazis. If you read the Nazi literature in occupied Europe, they were defending the population and the legitimate governments against the terror of the partisans who were directed from abroad. And like all propaganda, there's, even the most vulgar, there's a thread of truth to that. The partisans did carry out terror, and there's no question that they were directed from London, so they were carrying out terror directed from abroad. And the Vichy government is about as legitimate as most of the governments that the U.S. installs throughout the world or that other imperial powers have. So there's some marginal justification for this grotesque Nazi propaganda, which has close resemblance to ours. Same is true of the Japanese in Manchuria and North China. They were bringing the people an earthly paradise, defending the nationalist government of Manchuria against the Chinese bandits and so on. Very much like us. Actually, I once, in the 1960s, the RAND Corporation, the main research agency, mostly working for the Defense Department, published counterinsurgency documents, Japanese counterinsurgency documents from the 1930s. Actually wrote an article about it back in the mid-60s when these came out, comparing Japanese counterinsurgency documents in Manchuria and North China with U.S. counterinsurgency documents in Vietnam right at that moment. And they were very similar. Same reasoning, same justification, same thinking. It's not one of the more didn't have the best reception of any article I've ever written. Although I did see one reference to, in fact, I saw only one reference to it ever in the scholarly literature, an article on Japanese atrocities in North China and Manchuria, which had a footnote which pointed out, well, there are some people who've offered an interesting defense of Japanese atrocities, namely my article. And you can understand that. I mean, if I'm comparing Japanese atrocities to U.S. atrocities, since obviously U.S. atrocities are benevolent, it must be that I'm justifying Japanese atrocities. How else could you possibly interpret it? Anyway, as far as I know, this is kind of a universal principle. We do it, it's counter-terror or just war, and so on. They do it, it's terror. Scale doesn't matter, nothing matters. Well, that's through the 1980s. Let's go on to the 1990s and the present, see what happened since. So let's take today. Looking just at military aid, let's say. Let's put aside the top two, Israel and Egypt. It's a separate category, so I'll put them aside. You can bring them up later if you like. Putting them aside, first place worldwide was El Salvador during the period of their massive terror, but after the U.S. successfully defeated, U.S. Army defeated liberation theology, they dropped down. And first place was taken by Turkey. Turkey maintained first place until 1999, when it was replaced by Colombia. I might add a personal note. I've just returned from both countries from the site of some of the worst terrorist atrocities in the 1990s in southern Colombia last week, and in southeastern Turkey a couple of weeks earlier, but I'll keep my personal comments aside. Why Turkey? Turkey, of course, has always been a major recipient of U.S. military aid, strategically located, poised towards the Soviet Union, Middle East, and so on. So it got a stable and high level of U.S. military aid right through the Cold War period. In 1984, that changed. Military aid shot up, stayed high until 1998, increased through the 1990s. In the Clinton years alone, U.S. military aid to Turkey was higher than the entire Cold War period combined up until 1983, 4 times as high, in fact. In the year 1997, which was the peak year, it was higher than the entire Cold War period combined. And it was serious aid. It provided 80% of the arms for Turkish armed forces, and it wasn't pistols, it was jet planes and tanks and military advisors and so on. Well, what was the point? Well, the reason was that during those years, peaking in the 90s under Clinton, the Turkish government was carrying out state terror, namely against the Kurds, approximately a quarter of the population, miserably repressed population, and at that time a major war was being carried out against them. That's the area I visited. I'm borrowing the term state terror from several sources. One is well-known Turkish sociologist Ismail Basikci, who wrote a book in 1991 called State Terror in the Near East, including Turkish terror in Kurdish areas. He was immediately imprisoned. As far as I know, he's still in prison. He had already served 15 years in prison for reporting the facts on Turkish repression of the Kurds. Who have been miserably repressed for decades. Basikci was offered a $10,000 prize from the U.S. Fund for Freedom of Expression, but he turned it down because of the decisive U.S. support for state terror in Turkey. He felt he couldn't accept an award from the United States, and it is international terrorism. His imprisonment the second time was protested very strongly by writers and scholars and parliamentarians in Britain, not in the United States. And the reason is because it's not terror, since we're doing it, right? So therefore, what he's describing can't be terror, and therefore we don't have to protest it. Again, this major U.S. participation in international terrorism. He's not the only one who used the term. So in 1994, the Turkish state minister for human rights described the terror that the government was carrying out as his government as state terror. At that time, 2 million people, according to him, had been driven out of their homes. Every imaginable kind of barbaric atrocity. Thousands killed, tens of thousands killed. By now it's much worse. When I was there recently, the highly respected head of the Kurdish Human Rights Commission, incidentally highly respected by the U.S. Embassy as well, according to him, the toll by now is 3 million refugees, 50,000 killed, many of them, some I saw living in caves outside the walls of the city of Diyarbakir where I was and other similar places. He was, and shortly after I was there, he was picked up by the state security courts and indicted. He had committed a crime. Namely, there's a New Year's festival which celebrated throughout the region, and he had written about it, but in writing about it he had used the Kurdish spelling rather than the Turkish spelling. They differ in that one has a W and one has a V. So he's now under indictment with what consequences we don't know. Children a couple of children are found who are, say, wearing Kurdish, if you put their clothes together, it turns out to be Kurdish colors. That can be a serious threat and crime. While I was there, the journalist was arrested and since been in jail for playing a Kurdish song over the radio. His radio station was closed down. It goes on. I was actually there for a political trial, a publisher who was on trial for having published a collection of essays of mine, which included about 3 sentences, sort of drawn from standard human rights reports on Turkish repression of the Kurds. So he was on trial. There was enough international attention in that case so that he was released, but he's on trial for 6 other similar crimes now. And so it continues. While I was there in Diyarbakir, a remarkable act of courage took place at the end of a talk for a big audience, and in front of TV cameras and plenty of police cameras. 3 students came up and gave me a thick Kurdish English dictionary, which is an act of enormous bravery. You can't describe it. You have to know the situation to know what that means. Nobody can even figure out how it was sneaked into Turkey, let alone how they, I don't know what's happened to them. It's hard to trace. They get plenty of support, incidentally. Istanbul is not like the United States. There are plenty of writers, journalists, academics, others who constantly struggle against these draconian laws and repression and face serious threats. They go to jail. It's not much fun to be in a Turkish jail. They're constantly doing it. While I was there, they presented to the state prosecutor a co-published book of banned writings, including writings of people in jail demanding to be prosecuted, again in the focus of international attention. It didn't happen. Those are the kinds of things that people do when they're really under repression, not like here when people pretend to be under repression and kind of laugh at it because it's so ludicrous. But these are the kinds of things that intellectuals do in places where they take civil rights seriously, human rights seriously. They desperately need support of every kind, and primarily from here. Well, there is a reaction here to Turkish state terror, and namely it's highly praised. So, for example, the State Department in the peak year in 1999, after this had succeeded, if you like, published its annual report on terror and singled out Turkey for what it called its positive experiences in combating terror. Picked out Turkey alongside of Algeria and Spain. I don't know if they mention Algeria. In the case of Spain, they were, I suppose, referring to the Spanish officials who weren't yet in jail for terrorist atrocities. So these were the 3 countries picked out for their positive experiences in combating terror. The U.S. ambassador has just written in an academic journal that the U.S. could have no better friend and ally than Turkey, as demonstrated in its anti-terror campaign, namely the one I've just described. And the Turkish government is quite grateful for this. The Prime Minister was the first to offer the United States troops, ground troops, for its anti-terror campaign in Afghanistan, its war against terror in Afghanistan. And he explained why. This was in gratitude for the U.S. assistance, which was unique in helping the Turkish state combat terror in the manner to which I've just alluded. The Turkish army is now protecting Kabul against terror with U.S. funding, meaning one of the troops that have carried out some of the worst terrorist atrocities of the 1990s with U.S. funding are now being funded by one of the leading terrorist states in the world as part of the war against terror, and this elicits no comment, none. You can check and see, and again, tells us something about ourselves. So it's not that it's overlooked. I don't know what Orwell would have made of this, but we can make of it what we like. Well, in 1999, Turkey was replaced as leading recipient of U.S. arms by Colombia. The reason is that Turkish atrocities had succeeded in repressing the population sufficiently. Colombian atrocities had not yet succeeded. And they're significant. In the 1990s, Colombia had by far the worst human rights record in the hemisphere, and conforming to the standard correlations, it received more U.S. aid, including military aid, than the rest of the hemisphere combined. That's the normal relationship. Correlation continues. The atrocities are horrifying. There's actually one where the Colombian state actually investigated it. A chainsaw massacre where the Colombian army went into some area and cut the people up with chainsaws and threw them in pits and so on. There was actually a punishment for that. The high officer in charge was removed from his command. so can't say there's impunity. They have the world record now in killing trade unionists and journalists. I was there a couple of years ago on an Amnesty International mission. This was an international Amnesty International campaign to defend human rights, protect human rights defenders in countries. They picked Colombia as the first place to go because it had by far the worst record in killing human rights defenders and advocates. Right now, by now, apparently, political murders have risen to about 20 a day. There are 10,000 new displaced people every month. That's added to the 2 million who are already there. They're driven into miserable slums, no health care, no education, no nothing. The atrocities have been investigated, and there's no real dispute about them. About 80% are attributed either to the military or the paramilitaries, who are closely tied to the military. If you look over the last 10 years, you find that within that 80% or 75%, the percentage attributed to the military have been declining, and the percentage attributed to the paramilitaries have been rising. That's for a good reason, for a public relations reason. The Colombian army understands, as well as everybody else, that the best way to carry out terror is by privatizing it, hand it off to paramilitaries, like the Indonesians in East Timor or the Serbs in Bosnia and so on. This is pretty standard. Then you can say you're clean unless you look at the analyses by academics and human rights reports, like, say, Human Rights Watch, which simply refers to the paramilitaries as the 6th division of the Colombian army, in addition to the 5 official divisions, the division that's assigned the responsibility for horrendous atrocities in an effort at plausible deniability, as it's called. Colombia is also praised. It's praised for its human rights record by Clinton, for example, as a leading democracy, and for its economic reforms. Of those 3 praises, the third is correct. Colombia also has probably the world's record in privatization, that is, handing over its resources to foreign investors. And it is a bonanza for investors. As I mentioned, part of the privatization is privatization of terror. And the U.S. is also privatizing its own contribution to international terrorism. So by now there are plenty of American advisors, but there are probably twice as many U.S. military officers there technically within private companies like DynCorp and MPRI. The purpose of that is the same. It's deniability. The privatization of international terrorism means that the advice and arms are free from congressional supervision. There is some congressional legislation which the government is required to, human rights conditions the government's required to satisfy to give aid. The standard way to satisfy them is to issue waivers. That's what Clinton did, saying, well, we're just disregarding them. But Congress added stronger requirements. Now you can't just issue a waiver. So a couple of weeks ago, Colin Powell determined that Colombia meets Washington's human rights standards, which unfortunately is accurate. If you want the Human Rights Amnesty International detailed report on this, you can find it. It tells you a lot. Well, what's the result? Actually, I saw it down in southern Colombia. I was there for a couple days in Cauca, which happens to be the location of the worst human rights, has the worst human rights record of any province in the last year, and that's quite bad. It's a province mostly of indigenous people, campesinos and Afro-Colombians. They did succeed in organizing what they call a social bloc, carrying out educational and social and health and other reforms. They even succeeded, to everybody's astonishment, in electing their own governor, proud, impressive, indigenous man. I think that's the first time in the history of the hemisphere that any indigenous person has been elected to high office. The consequence, I met him and he is impressive. The consequences of those achievements were the usual ones. Paramilitaries were sent in. They're now spreading over the region. Atrocities are shooting up. Not many people expect the governor to survive his term, let alone everyone else. I did spend a couple hours listening to testimonies of poor peasants, and they, of course, talked about the terror, but the worst terror that they have suffered, at least the ones I got testimonies from, were direct U.S. terror, namely fumigation. Fumigation completely destroys their lives, destroys their crops, kills their animals. The children are dying. You can see them with scabs all over their bodies and things like that. These are poor coffee farmers mostly. Coffee farming is tricky. Prices are low, but they did succeed in carving themselves a niche in the international markets for organically produced high-quality coffee sold in Germany and places like that. That's gone. I mean, once the coffee trees are destroyed and the land is fumigated, poisoned, it's finished, poisoned forever. Not only are our lives destroyed and crops, but biodiversity is also destroyed, and rather crucially, the tradition of peasant agriculture is destroyed. That's a very rich tradition in every part of the world. That's why they have such high yields and so on. A lot of understanding and lore, that's gone. You can't go back to it. The consequence, if this area ever goes back to agriculture, will be monoculture for agro-export with laboratory-produced seeds bought from Monsanto. There's no real other alternative. But the main thing is that once the population is driven out by U.S. chemical warfare and crop destruction, then you can open it up for strip mining to apparently a rich coal fields around, for dams, for hydroelectric power, for international corporations, and so on. So that, too, looks like a success. It's a consequence. As for the people and the cultures and the communities, well, forget about that. It doesn't really matter. They are, to quote a famous philosopher, mere things whose lives have no value. Actually quoting Hegel, speaking on Africans. But that's our attitude. They are mere things whose lives have no value. So therefore we can proceed with this with complete equanimity. Of course, total impunity and only praise for the achievements. And that's our attitude. They're kind of like the Kurds in southeast Turkey, or like others. So to quote the editor of the New Republic, on his favorite topic, he writes that the Palestinians should become another crushed nation like the Kurds and the Afghans, and the Palestinian problem, which is boring, will be resolved. It's the standard way to deal with mere things. Not new. It was recently reiterated by the House Majority Leader, Dick Armey, a couple of weeks ago, who gave his solution to the Israel-Palestine problem, namely the Arabs should all leave. I mean, after all, there's plenty of other places in the world, so why don't they just get out, and then the problem will be solved, which is the right way to deal with mere things, and is indeed our attitude towards mere things. Easy to prove. It all undertaken in order to crush people's lives. So keeping to the Western Hemisphere, there are now 2 countries which are under U.S. embargo. Incidentally, they happen to be the 2 countries which were the leading recipients of slaves back in those days, namely Cuba and Haiti. In the case of Cuba, this has been going on for 40 years. It's part of a much broader campaign of warfare against Cuba. Cuba, as you know, was just renamed as one of the leading terrorist states. The reason, presumably, is that it's the leading target of international terrorism for the last 40 years, maybe more than the rest of the world combined. Maybe Lebanon's up there somewhere. This has gone on since 1959. The pretext up until 1989 was that we had to defend ourselves from this tentacle of the Russian Empire, which was about to strangle us. So therefore, we had to support terror and economic warfare. In 1989, that pretext sort of lost its place, and instantly, without batting an eyelash, we shifted to another pretext. That was forgotten, and the embargo got harsher, and it was because of our love of democracy, it turned out. And ever since then, we've been carrying out economic warfare and supporting terror against Cuba because of our love of democracy, as demonstrated in countries like, say, Colombia, which actually did once allow an independent party a couple of years ago. And it was even allowed to run in elections, which is a little difficult because within a couple of years, 3,000 of its leading figures were murdered by U.S.-backed death squads, including presidential candidates and mayors and so on. But it's still a great democracy as compared to, say, Cuba. And won't go on. The embargo is unusually severe, in fact unique, in that it effectively bars food and medicine. It's in violation of every imaginable humanitarian law you can think of, and is condemned by the whole world. The shift from defending ourselves against Cuban attack as an outpost of the Russian Empire and our love of democracy, that took place without notice. You know, you can check back and see how many people commented on this sudden change. And that makes sense because the fear of communism was also a total fraud. We know that and have known it for years because of the declassified internal record. Since it's late, I won't quote it, but if you'd like, I will quote it, which is very revealing, which from the Kennedy administration. I suppose that's why it's never cited. Historian Arthur Schlesinger submitted the secret documents analyzing this, and they're quite revealing. The effects of the Cuban embargo, well, there's a standard line here, which was just repeated by President Carter a couple of weeks ago, which says the embargo helps Castro and, of course, doesn't harm the Cubans. The only people who are harmed by it are North Americans, like farmers, who, agribusiness that wants to export there and so on. But it has no effect on Cuba except to improve life there and help Castro. There are other people who've looked, like the American Association of World Health, which did a detailed study a couple of years, 2 or 3 years ago, published 300 pages of documentation on it, and concluded that the embargo had dramatically harmed health and nutrition in Cuba, caused a significant rise in suffering and death. It would have been a humanitarian catastrophe, they said, except that it was averted by the Cuban health system, which is quite astonishing. Though it did direct resources in the health system away from other needs with the obvious consequences. So the embargo has been a success, like the U.S. Army's defeat of liberation theology. Well, that's one of the 2 embargoes. The other is possibly more grotesque. That's Haiti. Haiti has been the main target of U.S. military intervention and other intervention for the last century. It's now the poorest country in the hemisphere. May not survive another generation or 2. Another correlation you might want to think about that actually generalizes. It was invaded by Woodrow Wilson in what's called an exercise of Wilsonian idealism, if you've studied international relations theory. The Marines invaded in 1915, destroyed the parliamentary system, reinstituted slavery, killed nobody knows how many people, Haitians say about 15,000, turned the country into a plantation for U.S. Investors, instituted a National Guard, which is a brutal, murderous force, which has run the place pretty much ever since under U.S. backing. I won't run through the whole history, but it continued right through the mid-1990s when Bush and Clinton supported the military junta directly, right through the worst terror. Happens to be another thing that I saw personally for a couple of days. The U.S. right now, nearby here, one of the leading criminals is hidden by the United States. Emmanuel Constant has already been sentenced in Cuba for terrorist crimes. He was the head of the paramilitary force that was responsible for killing maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people in Haiti in the early 90s when Bush and Clinton were supporting the military junta. Haiti's tried to extradite him, but of course the U.S. doesn't even bother responding, and the press won't even comment on it. Why should we extradite a major killer who's only involved in killing a couple of thousand people, especially because if he goes back, he'll probably spill the beans on direct U.S. Connections to the terror that was going on at the time, and again, that elicits no comment. There is medical commentary on this, primarily by Paul Farmer, who many of you may know, who's written about it recently. By 1995, after the junta was finally thrown out. The Inter-American Development Bank did begin, and other aid agencies began projects to try to rebuild what was left of the battered public health system, but that's been stopped. They wanted to try to reverse the decline in life expectancy, the only case of that in this hemisphere. That was stopped by the embargo. That blocked $500 million worth of aid that was coming from them and other sources. And it terminated the projects and, of course, exacerbated the already horrendous conditions. The only help they're getting is from Cuba, as is in the case of many other poor countries, a lot of Cuban medical personnel, but they can't compensate for the losses. Haiti, incidentally, is paying interest on the loans that are blocked and that it isn't getting, just to add to the catastrophe. So that's the second embargo. This is being also imposed because of our love of democracy, as Powell and others have explained. Well, without going on, there is actually an interesting and rather flourishing literary genre in the United States now, best-selling books, articles all over, and so on, which does discuss, which is focusing on a flaw in our character, a strange flaw. Namely, why don't we respond properly to the crimes of others? Major books on this. And it's a kind of an interesting topic, like it might merit a footnote in a study of our attitude toward human rights. A footnote where the main topic, of course, would be a different one, namely, why do we keep participating, crucially, in human rights violations of the most severe kind, including atrocities? But that's an unaskable question. You can ask about our inadequacy in responding to the crimes of others, but you can't ask questions about anything that I've been talking about our own massive crimes, because that would be to concede that there are such crimes, and that's inconceivable. You know, how could that be? If you try to raise that question, you're kind of off the spectrum somewhere. Similarly, there are plenty of grave commentary these days on what we should do to combat the plague of terror, and it's serious. There's dangerous terrorist threats all over. There is actually one simple way of decreasing very significantly the amount of terror in the world, and that is just stop carrying it out. That would have a major effect right there. I mean, it wouldn't solve everything, but a big piece of it would be gone. However, you'll search in vain for any discussion of that elementary point. Well, until questions of this kind move into the agenda, in fact, become the center of attention, discussion of topics of this nature can't really be taken very seriously, and suffering people throughout the world will simply sink deeper into misery.
I was wondering if you could reflect a little on what's happened here in that span of time, when it just seems to me that things have gotten a lot worse, and I'm almost getting sentimental from Nikita Khrushchev, and sort of the trajectory of what's happened, and where do you see a possible upswing?
Well, actually, my impression, you know, these are subjective things, but my impression is the opposite, that things have gotten a lot better. So just to illustrate, keep to the war in Vietnam, this March, so last March 2002, was an important anniversary. It was the 40th anniversary of the public announcement by the Kennedy administration that U.S. pilots were bombing South Vietnam. That was the month in which the use of chemical warfare was initiated to destroy crops. Napalm was authorized, and programs were initiated to drive millions of people into concentration camps where they'd be surrounded by barbed wire and protected, as it was said, from the guerrillas who the government recognized they were willingly supporting. That was that's the beginning of the U.S. war against South Vietnam, major war after a long period of terrorist atrocities. There was no commemoration of this in March. The reason is because nobody knows it happened. It was public, you know, like it wasn't secret. It was public, but nobody cared. the Vietnamese were mere things, people whose lives have no value. If the U.S. Air Force wants to bomb them and carry out chemical warfare and drive them into concentration camps and so on, what's the issue? I mean, I don't know where you were in those days, but I remember trying to give talks about these things, and you could maybe get 3 people to show up in a church or something. It was just not an issue, you know. Well, over the years that changed. 4 or 5 years later, by the time hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese had been massacred and the country half destroyed and the war spread to the rest of Indochina, it did become a significant issue. And that was part of not among intellectuals, incidentally. If you look at attitudes among intellectuals and among the general population, they are radically different. So by the end of the 1960s, approximately 70% of the population was describing the war as fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. And that's a figure that's held pretty steady until today. If you check attitudes among educated people, among articulate intellectuals, almost nobody said that. I mean, statistically insignificant. The most you could hear is it was a mistake, it cost us too much, you know, I don't want to see that many napalm children on television, few is okay, but not that many, that sort of thing. Almost no principled opposition to the war. That split also continues until today, not just on this issue. But among the population, there was a substantial change, and not just on this issue. Since in the last 40 years, the country has just become a lot more civilized in many respects. It's not just opposition to aggression and atrocities. I mean, the big popular movements that have had a massive effect on the country aren't even from the 60s. They're from the 70s and the 80s. So there was only the bare beginnings of a feminist movement in the 60s. Became a major popular movement in subsequent years. The environmental movement almost didn't exist. It's the 70s and the 80s. The same with the solidarity movements, the anti-nuclear movement, the currently what's called ridiculously anti-globalization, meaning support for a form of globalization that has concern for people, not investors. Those are all much more recent things, and they're massive, and they've changed the character of the country. And the result is that things are just much different. Things that happen are horrible, but they're much more constrained. Things that were just taken for granted at that time are very hard to pursue now. That's why, incidentally, in the 1980s, the Reagan administration had to turn to what was called clandestine warfare. Like they couldn't directly duplicate what their model John F. Kennedy had done outright. They had to carry out clandestine warfare, which means atrocities known to everybody except the American population. So certainly the victims, certainly the other countries that are participating, the client states, certainly the media, except they don't tell you about it, and so on. But they have to keep it from the population because the population won't tolerate it. And that's true on issue after issue. So to get to the topic that I said I wouldn't talk about, right now the large majority of the U.S. population favors a long-standing international consensus on the political settlement of the Israel-Palestine problem. It's been around for 25 years. It's now called the Saudi Plan, but it was presented first in 1976 when the U.S. vetoed it at the Security Council. People don't know and cannot know from the information presented to them that their own government is the primary barrier to implementing this settlement. If they did know that, they'd do something about it. That's why it's kept secret, along with plenty of other things. So I think, look, it's not a pretty world, but I think things have improved. There are many different measures of this, and it's pretty substantial, and I think it's very important. It shows that things can be achieved in the only ways that are around, by educational efforts, by organizing, by activism of all sorts. And we have every opportunity open to us. We're not in Turkey. We're not in Colombia. We're not going to get assassinated. We're not going to get thrown into prisons. Every option is open, and we have all kinds of privilege. It's just a question whether you want to pursue them.
I'd just like to ask your opinion. If you look, for example, at the Nazi extermination of the Jews, the figures of Hannah Arendt, I believe, gives a figure of 4.5 million Jews,
well, standard, yeah, whatever it is, 6 million, let's say.
Just for argument's sake, let's settle at 4.7.
Well, let's settle at 6 million.
Okay.
Maybe more, maybe less. Nobody really knows.
The number of people killed in the Indochina War, the most conservative is 2 million. Human rights organizations have said 4 million.
That's if you don't count the consequences, like the people who are still dying from dioxin poisoning, say.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I've also heard figures that are, say, around 5 million. So if we look at those figures, the number of Jews killed by the Nazis and the number of people killed by our leaders were roughly the same.
Well, that's one incident.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. But can't one argue, and
don't forget 25 million people in East Europe killed by the Nazis.
Oh,
there's a lot more.
I'm not forgetting those figures. I'm fully aware of that. But my point here is, I hope you'll agree, because otherwise I'll just wallow in misery. And what he did in Vietnam was the intent. The Nazis intended to exterminate the Jewish population in
Yeah,
Europe.
that was a difference.
The intent in Vietnam was not genocide.
It's true. I'd never call what happened in Vietnam genocide. It's not the right term for it. I agree, totally different. Actually, it's different in all sorts of respects. The Nazis really are historically unique. There's been a lot of atrocities in human history, but industrialized mass extermination of the style that the Nazis carried out is off the spectrum. There's just nothing that compares to it. It's not the Jews and the Roma, what we call the Gypsies, who were treated about the same way, and some other groups. Yeah, that was unique. But there are plenty of atrocities in the world, and we're responsible. With a lot of them trace right back to us, and a lot of them aren't even counted. So let me give you an example that isn't counted. Okay, you'll remember, I'm sure, that a book that came out and was a big bestseller about a year ago called The Black Book of Communism. Front page reviews in the New York Times, all over the place. It was a translation of a French book which estimated the number of people killed by the communists at 100 million. Okay, well, without quibbling about the numbers, let's say it's right. Okay, the biggest component of that, about 25 million, was a Chinese famine. Famine in China in 1958, 1960, which it's estimated killed about 25 million people. The reason why that's called a political crime, an ideological crime, which is a good reason in my opinion, was discussed in most detail by Amartya Sen. That's part of what he won the Nobel Prize for, Nobel Prize winning economist, who treated this as an ideological crime for good reasons. He said it wasn't intent. They didn't intend to kill anybody. It's just that the ideological institutions were such that it happened. It was a totalitarian state when the information, no information about what was happening ever even got back to the center. They couldn't take any actions because that's what happens in a totalitarian state. So it was a reflection of the totalitarian institutions, a huge massacre, which wasn't intended, like they intend to kill 25 million people, but it was still a major massacre. And it's correct to call it one of the major atrocities of the 20th century, and the worst part, the worst single component of the crimes of communism. That's accurate. That bears on your question of intent. But that's only half the story. If you look at Amartya Sen's work, for which he won the Nobel Prize and for which he's famous academically, he studied famines and the conditions that lead to them. And as part of this, major part, he compared India and China. Okay, compared them. Of course, India, while it was under British rule, it had huge famines all the time. Tens of millions of people dying. But nobody counts that among the crimes of British imperialism, right? Because again, we do it. It's not a crime. But starting from independence, as Sen points out, India didn't have any more major, had plenty of starvation, but didn't have major famines of that kind. So from 1947 until the time when he did his work, around 1980, there were no major famines. And he compares that with China, which did have this one major famine. And he points out that's a difference in institutions. In India, which was democratic, if information appeared about hunger somewhere, the central authorities could do something about it. So there weren't major famines. That's part of what he wrote. But then he continued. That part is known all over the place. Here's the rest. Same articles, same books, but not known. He then said, well, let's compare the death rates in China and India from 1947 until the time he wrote. Okay, it says approximately the same around 1947, similar countries and so on. The mortality rates started decline in China pretty sharply. They stayed very high in India. And he regards that as an ideological crime too. He says the difference is that China instituted rural health clinics, preventive medicine for the poor, and so on and so forth, and it led to a significant improvement in health standards. So you get a decline in mortality rates. India didn't. It was a democratic capitalist country, which you don't do anything for poor people. Okay, and he then points out that if you take a look at the difference between those curves, well, let me just quote him. He says every 8 years, India put as many skeletons in its closet as China did during its years of shame. That incidentally comes to about 100 million in India alone from 1947 to 1980. But we don't call that a crime of democratic capitalism, right? If we were to carry out that calculation throughout the world, I mean, I won't even talk about it. But Sen is correct. They're not intended, just like the Chinese famine wasn't intended, but they are ideological and institutional crimes, and we're responsible for them. Okay, and we don't have the entire responsibility, but certainly a large part of it. So yes, if you count crimes, it's an ugly record, but it's only the enemy's crimes that count. They're the ones that we deplore and agonize about and so on. Our own, which may be monstrously worse, they just don't enter into our field of vision. You don't study about them, you don't read about them, you don't think about them, nobody writes about them. We're just not allowed to think about it. And we agree, if we agree to that, that's something about us, you know, it's a choice.
Professor, actually part and parcel of what you were just talking about there, you alluded before to the recently declassified Kennedy administration papers that talk about Cuba and what we were doing there. One question that I have for you, I know that in a lot of interviews that I've read in the past, you talked about the need to be very diligent in dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's and looking and really documenting all of the sources that you have if you're going to challenge the popular political religion, as you call it. I'd just like to know what your assessment is of the Freedom of Information Act, and how you think that it compares to things in other nations and the likelihood that it could be improved upon, because that really is the number one source where we can get the information.
Well, the Freedom of Information Act is, as far as I'm aware, unique. I don't think any other country has anything like it, at least none that I know of. And it's part of something much more general. I mean, the U.S. is a very free society by comparative standards. It's not just the Freedom of Information Act. I mean, just release of government documents. It happens fairly, you know, they don't release everything, and there's a lot of flaws and horrible, you know, terrible omissions. But by and large, it compares very favorably with any other country I know about, including England and France and others. I mean, I really haven't investigated it in close detail, so I probably shouldn't say. But to my knowledge, the release of documents in the United States is at least comparable to, probably much better than other countries. This was true up until the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration blocked, and in fact a release of, this is supposed to be a 30-year gap, so they're talking about the 50s. They blocked and probably destroyed the documents having to do with the U.S. overthrow of the governments of Iran and Guatemala. That caused furor among the diplomatic historians. The State Department historians, who were a pretty conservative lot, actually went public on that one, made a public denunciation of the Reagan administration for blocking for destroying the historical record. The current Bush administration is doing the same thing, maybe even worse, and also eliciting similar commentary. So there are, you know, whatever name you want to give them, quasi-fascist or some other word, pick your word, tendencies in high places that try to eliminate the freedoms that exist, but we shouldn't overlook the fact that they exist. The same is true of freedom of speech. I mean, I don't know of any other country that has the same protections for freedom of speech. England certainly doesn't, nor the continent. And that's not very old. You know, people say the Bill of Rights. It had nothing to do with the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights didn't offer those freedoms. This was won in the 1960s in the course of the civil rights struggle. And in fact, most freedoms, if you check back, are won in the course of popular struggles. Freedom of speech was established by the Supreme Court in 1964. Before that, it was very weak protection. And it's something that we ought to be, guard and be proud of. It was achieved by public, by very courageous people, most of whom nobody knows their names. Talk about the civil rights movement, you think of Martin Luther King, which is correct, an important person, but he would have been the first to tell you that he was riding the crest of a wave. The civil rights movement was carried out by unknown young black people, mostly young, in the South, who suffered bitterly. Many were killed, many were destroyed, and whose names are unknown. They're not part of history unless you really study it. And that's also true of just about every other achievement that I know of. But it's real, and it's important, and it should be guarded. And there are attacks on it, you're correct. Freedom of Information Act has been restricted now, and we should try to get it back. If you look at the declassified record, and take a look someday, really hard, and see what you find. You find, in my opinion, you find very little material that has anything to do with, say, national security or defense of the country or anything like that. What you find mostly is the need to defend the government against its own population. Most of what's there, they just don't want you to know because harms power, kind of like clandestine warfare. And that continues right now. Like everything I've talked about, could be known, could be on the front pages. International economic agreements are barely known and barely discussed. And there's a very simple reason for it. They explain it in the Wall Street Journal. They say opponents of these agreements have what they call an ultimate weapon, namely the populations opposed to them. So therefore you have to keep them secret. And you have to carry them out behind closed doors and so on because the population is just opposed. So, within the framework of freedom of speech, there are lots of opportunities for repression. That's the duty of intellectuals. The task of educated people, intellectuals, public intellectuals, and the rest, is to keep the population from knowing things that they shouldn't know, because if they know, they're going to do something about it. That may sound like an exaggeration, but I don't think it is. And it's not just true of this country. It's true quite generally and goes way back in history. So you gotta, takes work. It's not going to come free.
There was an article in the New York Times on Friday about the Minneapolis office, the FBI office in Minneapolis, that had information concerning the Sidel, and they brought that information to the headquarters of FBI, which blocked a criminal investigation and or search warrants into the Sidel. And then that office was so frustrated, then took the information to the CIA. And the CIA also sat on it and refused to investigate this long before the planes were used as missiles. So at worst, this is negative. I want to know, in your opinion, given the history of U.S.'s involvement in atrocities, could this possibly be an effort to consolidate more power and control? Or is it just a case of negative?
Well, look, possible covers a lot of ground, so yeah, it's possible. Is it plausible? I honestly don't think so. I mean, I don't have access to the massive hidden information that the FBI and CIA looks at, but I think it's possible to make a fair guess. The intelligence services are flooded with information of a very dubious character. It's very hard to evaluate. You don't know what's important. The people, maybe they're competent, maybe they aren't. It's another question. But even if the most brilliant group of physicists you can find was reading this stuff, they wouldn't know what's important. There's just too much junk flooding in. In retrospect, you can see what was important. But at the time, there's no way of knowing. They're probably flooded with information right now. Look, it's been known for years. You read technical papers. It's been pointed out for years that with contemporary technology, small groups can carry out major terrorist acts, meaning the West, which has had a virtual monopoly of violence for hundreds of years, is now losing it. It still has an overwhelming preponderance of violence, but it's not a total monopoly anymore. That's why September 11th was just such a shock. First time in hundreds of years that the West was subjected to what it does to other people. okay, and that's shocking. So yes, there's no longer a monopoly of violence, and it could be much worse. You can read articles in technical papers a couple of years ago. Actually, I wrote about it long before September 11th, just using public information, that it wouldn't be that hard to assemble a 15-kilogram nuclear weapon in a New York hotel room and be a dirty bomb, like a Hiroshima-style bomb maybe, but cause incredible damage. That's been known. But the question is, what do you pursue? How many hints can you possibly pursue? Well, it's incomparable. The chances are, like when the government says we're probably going to face other major terrorist acts, they're probably right. The nature of technology is such that unless you deal with the sources of these actions, yes, you're going to get some pretty horrible ones. And information must be flooding in all the time, and my own guess is that it's just inability to deal with the information that's around. I doubt that there's anything more than that behind it.
I was wondering what you think the extent of the U.S. Of the U.S. involvement in the recent Venezuelan coup and what its motivations are.
Well, the Venezuelan coup was pretty dramatic. What happened? First of all, everybody had been expecting a coup. It's the circumstances in which you expect a coup. Anything about U.S. history and about the U.S. and the Western Hemisphere particularly, these are the conditions under which a military coup takes place. Actually, when I was in Colombia last week, somebody told me a joke that circulates around there, a riddle. They ask, how come the United States has never had any military coups? And the answer is because there's no American embassy there. And that's more or less that's more or less the story. Understood everywhere in the hemisphere outside of the United States. So yes, everyone was anticipating a coup. Chavez is just too independent, and he's doing things for poor people and whatever. When the coup took place, as anticipated, all of Latin America, including the most reactionary figures, bitterly condemned it. The United States applauded it instantly. New York Times told you how wonderful it was, and so on. That was kind of embarrassing. Now, if the coup had stayed, it would have been suppressed. But the coup was quickly overthrown by popular reaction. And at that point, it really became embarrassing. They had to backtrack, say they didn't say it. They said the opposite, and so on and so forth. But what happened is pretty obvious. Whether there was actually a U.S. role in instigating the coup, we don't know. You'll have to wait 30 years and hope that you don't have a Reagan in office then, but somebody will allow his documents to come out, and then maybe you'll find out. Or maybe things will be learned from other sources, as they can be. But it's a fair guess that the U.S. was at least sympathetic and maybe active in instigating it, and certainly supported it. That's not even in question. Will there be another coup in Venezuela? I wouldn't be surprised. If Chavez is not tamed, that won't be tolerated. It's too important a country. It has a huge amount of oil and other resources. It's the first country. It's another example of Wilsonian idealism. That was the first country that the U.S. moved to outside of its own region. Wilson, in 1920, kicked the British out. The British were the main enemy of the United States through most of its history because they were a big, powerful state and were a deterrent, deterring the U.S. But he was able by then to kick the British out and support a brutal dictator, and the U.S. continued to support one or another monster over the years, sometimes giving them medals of honor in Washington and that sort of thing. Meanwhile, enriching investors with the country's enormous resources. So one is oil, but also others, iron, minerals, and so on. And that's not going. It's the major known source of oil in the Western Hemisphere by now, and that the U.S. will not allow that to get out of its hands any more than they'll allow Iraqi oil to stay out of their hands for very long. The main reason, I think, for the likely attack on Iraq.
I think that should be the last question.
No,
Yeah. That was the last question.
I'm sorry. Gotta go off to something else, I'm afraid.
So if you
I have a boss too. My wife.